as part of our Think 2025 dialogue, where we talk about sustainable development in Pakistan, especially from the perspective of energy and climate change, we have a very distinguished guest with us today. It's somebody with on-ground experience and expertise of having worked with multiple global agencies as well as within the government. We have today with us Mr. Asad Aleem. Mr. Asad Aleem is the principal energy consultant for Asian Development Bank in Pakistan. Mr. Aleem has also had experience of working with World Bank in a similar capacity. In the past, you've been in bureaucracy and you spent time in England in private sector. MBA in the private sector. You worked for British Rail. And that's where we have a common experience where I used to work for utility in UK for a long time. So Asad, thanks a lot for joining us. I think it's very exciting that you're here. I think primarily from the perspective that ADB is a big enabler and has been active in Pakistan for a long time and is currently working on some very exciting projects within the energy sector. So it's very relevant to our discussion, being an energy platform. So Asad, I just want to start off with just get an understanding of how ADB, Asian Development Bank, sees the energy infrastructure in Pakistan, and what are the structural problems that we need to solve when it comes to energy.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. Okay, now ADB is by far the largest development partner of the government of Pakistan. From 2005 onwards, we have invested nearly $8 billion into the sector. And that spans across the supply chain. We have put money in generation, transmission, distribution. We are providing analytical and advisory assistance, capacity development activities. So basically the thrust of our investment has been financing, which is one part, then knowledge products, knowledge, information, and then the partnerships with the private sector, with the NGOs and whatnot. And the sector is like every year we have a pipeline for Pakistan energy, the projects pipeline of close to $2 billion. Out of this, approximately 40% has been comprising of energy sector projects. Of the total portfolio, which is roughly about 6 billion, 5 to 6 billion a year of the running projects, energy comprises about 45%. So it's a sizable chunk, and we are a very responsive development partner of the government of Pakistan. Currently, the ongoing projects, which now mind you, the projects which we do are on budget. So these projects are the priority projects of the government, unlike UNDP or USAID, which are off budget in a sense that they have their own political dimension, but the money from ADB comes to meet the priorities of the government. So over the past 5 years, if I see generation crisis of the past decade, so we have come up with the retrofitting of Jamshoro coal power plant, supercritical. But having said that, the main issues which is confronting the energy sector, the power sector, the power subsector, is now the transmission. So the transmission bottlenecks, and that is giving rise to huge capacity payments. Over the past 10 years, I would say, in fact, over the past 5 years, about 13 gigawatt power has been added under the CPEC program, but the transmission and the distribution has not kept pace. So this has given rise to capacity payments of about 45 to 50%, and that is adding up to the tariff, which is becoming unsustainable. So our thrust of our program currently, for 50% of the financing is towards transmission and distribution networks. The circular debt, which is a governance and a financial issue, has to be tackled, and this year we are coming up with a reform program which would be spanned over 3 tranches of about 1 billion and comprising some co-financing from other development partners. That is addressing the reforms in the sector. And so we are have aligned our program with the IMF and with the World Bank. So over the next 12 months, we have a program which would curtail or in fact eliminate the flow of the circular debt by the end of 2020. Until and unless there is not sufficient liquidity in the sector, bringing this private sector, or have a competitive market, this does not bode well. because the driver is the cash, so until and unless cash is available for the operations, for the maintenance, as well as for new investments and paying the upstream generators, things would pretty much stall and the investment outlook would be very dismal.
So thanks a lot for that. I think it's great and heartening to see how much money ADB is spending in Pakistan. I think we've been starved of foreign investment in dollars. I mean, we know what the situation is with that front. And the fact that you're spending so much money here, I think solve some of our fundamental problems is great. But I'll be a bit controversial here. I think the way we see the energy problem, and I think at the heart of this energy problem, I guess, is the unsustainability of the finances. At the front end, you see this very high cost generation, and all of that, or majority of that, being procured by this single buyer, which is the government. And at the back end, you have, again, the same entity selling most of the power and losing 30% odd of that in the system. So fundamentally, it looks like this common element, which is the single buyer, single seller, is the root cause of a lot of our problems. And you mentioned, private sector participation in this whole equation. Do you think that the fact that you're primarily working with the government priorities, and the government priorities remain more towards sustaining the existing infrastructure in energy, existing system, while there are some initiatives and to develop the private market, we haven't seen a lot of development happening on that front. So how do you see this,
no, you're
planning out?
right. You're right that there are multiple inefficiencies in the government, and we seem like putting more money into that inefficient machine. But until and unless, the backbone, which is the transmission link, and that is sorted out in a sense that more investments and more funds have been put into the system, and the constraints have been debottlenecked. The private sector, I don't think so, would be coming in until and unless there's an enabling environment in terms of infrastructure. So what ADB has been doing is we actually started working on this single buyer model. Now it's single buyer plus since 2008. The CPPA was created we assisted the Central Power Purchasing Agency's creation, and now we are moving towards a competitive model. But having said that, these things look very glittery in a sense, but in fact, until and unless the circular debt, as I indicated earlier, the finances of the sector cannot be sorted out. Now, it's a chicken and egg situation. I think so. The government has to take the lead over the next 3 to 4 years. We are engaging closely with the government, and they have a credible plan now to eliminate the circular debt. And only once the circular debt and the governance issues, there are some other issues as well in terms of institutional, regulatory, which I can discuss with you. Until those things are not sorted out in the next 3 to 4 years, the competitive model cannot be installed. And so this has to be done by the government to provide a level playing field, to provide encouraging environment, an optimistic environment for the private sector to come and invest in this country. There have been some other issues in terms of renewable energy. The policy expired. Now the new policy is coming. We have commented. We have seen the policy and commented. So it is a very forward-looking policy that is encouraging the private sector investments, and ADB itself has been providing debt and equity financing to multiple international players to invest in Pakistan in the generation side.
So you referred to that new draft policy that's coming out, and I think all of us have also given our feedback against that. I see, a lot of continuity in terms of the old model. I think the government is still looking to procure bulk of the power, for the future demand. And that's what I was referring to, I think, in terms of the single buyer model. That probably is continuing.
Yeah, you mean from B to B, like if a generator wants to sell directly to housing society or to a certain unit.
Don't you think it should be here faster? I mean, that could be enabled, because we see a lot of
I think so. Actually,
capacity in the system already.
And the system is over-regulated, I would say. The system is over-regulated. And so supposedly, if a private investor wants to sell power to a user which even does not use the grid. So why there is a requirement for NEPRA to give licenses, if it is a business to business deal. So this type of I think this has been addressed in the new policy, although it is still not approved. But the targets which they have given and the way they are requesting the donors to assist them in terms of bringing more investment, I think so that would change somehow at the upstream level, although still about 55% of the generation is with the private sector, but that would somehow address to bring cheaper indigenous generation, which is the starting point to bring down the cost of power in the country.
Sure. I think it's a step in the right direction. I guess I think the point we've been making to the government is couldn't come faster. And some of the areas probably they need to think more radically. As you said, I mean, it's over-regulated the market. I think they just need to open up a bit more. And I think the big unaddressed area is the 30%, unaccounted for off-grid customers. I want to talk a bit about the distributed model and what role that could play in the scheme of things going forward, because I think one thing that the forward-looking policy, let's say we've said by 2030 the government wants 30% of the capacity to be from renewable sources across wind, solar.
Which is ambitious. I don't think so they will be able to, but at least the targets are ambitious.
But there's no mention of how distributed generation will play a big part, or how big a part distributed generation will play in all of this. And we can see in countries like Germany, 90% of solar is all distributed. So what role do you think that distributed generation will play?
I think that is very important. Like in Africa, the grids have become, stranded assets in some countries because of their inefficient operations and maintenance, and people have taken themselves off the grid. And now about 70% of the population in Pakistan is connected to the grid. I would say 29 million customers. But there is a scope for another, 35-40%.
Population size of Turkey is still
that's right.
disconnected.
It's still disconnected. So having seen that, ADB in 2016 we approved an access to clean energy program, which is supporting the remote communities. It's a $325 million program for 2 provinces, Punjab and KP. It is supporting investments in the remote communities for a distributed distributed network. But I think the country is still not ready, I would say, for the large scale deployment of such distributed.
Why do you say that? May I ask? Why do you think it's not ready?
The control of the bureaucracy, the control of the public sector currently.
Just more regulatory.
Yeah, more regulatory. Then the cost of providing these distributed grids, unless the private sector comes into play, the public sector cannot. It doesn't. You have seen that the circular debt, there is no liquidity in the sector, so the investment has to come from outside, and the governments, they usually wish to invest, or the utility would like to invest where they get substantial returns. So substantial returns are in the urban areas, so which are connected to the grid. So distributed, for the time being, what we are thinking is that it should be in the remote areas across the country, which has less appeal in terms of revenue generation. Then in terms of operations and maintenance, in the far-flung areas, it is a challenge. Even in the settled areas, it is becoming difficult. So that's it will take some time. But the big room in the elephant is the liquidity in the sector and the transmission bottlenecks. I think we maybe the distributed generation could be maybe 5 to 10 years down the road. But currently, the big issues, the big ticket items have to be addressed.
Fair point. So I think that's also we see that's also one of the reasons why the 30% is still unaddressed, because there's so many issues with 70% of the network.
And 30% is there for maybe about 20 years now.
It hasn't progressed.
Yeah,
it hasn't moved in age.
Although the population is also increasing at an exponential rate, but that is more or less static.
Absolutely. So I think from our perspective, what we see is that probably that built-up area, that built-up grid, is where the private sector could play a bigger part, because the government has done its bit. It's laid out the network, which is an impossible task for the private sector. But now probably it needs to bring in the private sector to solve some of the inefficiencies and problems, and maybe focus on the 30% and regulation.
As well as I think this net metering, I think that is a way to go. I have seen in the West, I was in like in Australia, we had a site visit. So I think so that at least ISCO has started this, and I'm not sure about the other distribution companies.
I think it's happening all across.
It's happening all
safe
across.
to say
I have heard that some discos are reluctant because they lose their business, but that will be a way to go. people would, start, first of all, people might get off the grid and then they could sell back to the grid. That is another way, and it's a cheaper way, I would say,
So I think you're very right. I think it's moving the energy system towards what we call as democratization, where individual users are now putting up the power for their own use because the technology has become so cost effective, the economic curve has moved and efficiencies have improved, that they're becoming indigenous in their use. So that's one regulation I think you pointed out. Net metering is very correctly, I think, is now taking hold across Pakistan, which is great. The other one I want to talk about is wheeling. Now we've spoken about private sector participation. We've spoken about open market deregulation.
Third-party access, you mean, to the transmission lines?
Third-party access to transmission line and distribution line.
And even in the gas sector as well.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of discussion on that, but there has been hardly any movement. What do you think is the roadblock, and what do we need to do to enable the country towards a freer market, open access to this network?
Again, it all boils down to the finances. If the private sector would only invest if it gets the returns. Now, we have seen in case of IPPs, the payments made to them are so late. But there is a lot of potential. The first, this Matiari line, I think, first transmission line on the private sector. But having said that, what I think is transmission is still a business which is in many countries of the world is still held by the public sector. So the private sector has, I think, the low-hanging fruits or easy to justify investments is in the generation side of the supply chain or at the distribution side. Transmission is still very much like in the UK as well. The Transco, that was the both upstream and downstream were somehow privatized, but the transmission company was kept with the government for some time. So this is what we think is.
And now it's privatized, national grid.
Now it's privatized, but it was privatized way down,
Sure.
before the upstream and the downstream. The government, I think so, currently does not have any plan for, they are talking to us on privatization of discos. The IPPs are already, 55% is in the private sector. So the transmission, I think so, for the time being, I don't think so there is so much. And the bottleneck probably is still that the government still wants, first of all, there's a lot of investment so required, to debottleneck the system. And the government is talking to us and to the World Bank to bring more investment. So transmissions are more focused. So I don't think so the private sector would come in such a hurry to match with the added generation. So that's why they are relying on to at least for a certain threshold or for a certain amount of backbone infrastructure in transmission to be created. And then
so I think big sums are involved, and I think the loss of inefficiencies. I think NTDC has got an impossible task to connect all of the.
But I don't think so. The main problem is distribution. The NTDC, okay, losses are 6-7-8%, but the distribution, that is the main leaking bucket. Sure. So that has to be sorted out, and I think the private sector should come there. And as well as on the generation side, because if you find the components of losses, the distribution is the maximum, then it's a generation because of various issues upstream. Now all our investments or all our energy is somehow focused towards the downstream side always, but we have to look at the upstream side, that what the IPPs have promised to deliver, are they delivering that amount, the heat rates, the losses, and are they really meeting their own promises or their contractual obligations. Probably also NEPRA and they don't have the right capacity to inspect and to check the efficiencies of the power plants.
Fair point. So I just want to touch upon this model where you sort of very large power plant costing billions of dollars in one end of the country. Then you lay lines like Matiari, right, which is thousands of kilometers of cable, and evacuate that power to the other end. If you compare that to where the world is going, and I think where the developed markets are going, and I quote this example of UK quite a lot, and I think we've touched upon national grid, and the way they see national grid transitioning is that in 2012, the average size of a power plant was 900 megawatt. 2050, they're saying it's going to be 30 megawatt. So we normally, when we're doing a presentation, we show this picture where the transmission will completely go out of the picture, and you'll be left with these localized grid. In that context, I guess distribution end, I think it takes even more precedence. It's very high priority. So what proportion of what you would say is your time and your resources, ADB's resources, are being spent solving distribution problems compared to transmission?
You know, of all our investments currently at this point in time, about 47% is on distribution and transmission and the funding. And then we have, you know, access to clean energy off grid, and then Jamshoro plant, which is the generation side. But on the distribution side, what we are bringing is technology. You know, the smart metering project, then eventually it would transform into smart grid project. So that is, I think, the theft has to be controlled through technology. And so for initially this year, actually the project was approved in 2015 for the smart meters in LESCO and ISCO. But we have been requested by the government that for the to bring customized solutions, but all technological, like for PESCO, there is a lot of theft. So the aerial bundled cables and maybe the smart meters at the transformer level, so that they know that which feeder is losing what. So this could be one. And then for Balochistan, like tubals is a big issue. So we are coming up with the solar, we're designing a solar program at least to get them off the grid and be at the grassroots level. That's what. Yeah. So distribution and the maximum losses, and we have to compete it with technology. And the mafias there is such a strong, you know, mafia there that from the department side, that it's not easy to.
Fair point. It's a department, it's a local politics. There's a lot of dynamics locally that then need to be addressed. So I just want to touch upon two things quickly. One, I think renewable energy overall. I think renewable energy picture. I think it's fair to say that we've been lagging behind as a country compared to the rest of the region, compared to the rest of the world. Again, we see a situation where, you know, we are behind the curve and we're trying to build that sequential model towards development. What are the big impediments towards integrating more renewable power into our grid? I mean, there was this GOPA study which was kind of misleading at times because it treated the grid as one big monolith, one big network. Rather than treating as multiple nodes. So what are those things that are stopping us, and what can we do to enhance our readiness for more renewable integration?
First of all, over the past 10 years, we were having a generation crisis. So the best thing was to come up with these IPPs, and IPPs were here to make profit, the guaranteed rate of returns. So the thermal was the quick fix. And there was no planning because it was all crisis situation. So we had to bring up generation rental or whatever was available. You know.
So I'll be a bit more controversial now. So does the trade deficit, does the secular debt?
Yeah, that's right. 41%, you know, like is imported fuel still. So and that's a big. But the countries which have really made strides in renewable, if you quote China or India, you know, I would say that they have a competitive advantage, and the manufacturing facilities are there. So the solar panels, the wind turbines, you know, they are manufactured in India and China. That's why they had such an exponential growth. So Pakistan, with this new renewable energy policy, now they have to make a mind, they have to position themselves whether they want to be a hub of manufacturing to export, as well as once the manufacturing facilities are there, I think that really gives an impetus to increase the renewable energy capacity in the country. This is ADB's, you know, work, and we come up that. That's why China and even Germany, it used to be Germany.
So indigenization, you're saying to improve our economics?
No, the generation, the manufacturing of the equipment, if it is available in the country, you know, it is much cheaper.
It's much cheaper.
To compete, you know, to the other sources of generation. That's why India and China, because the Vestas, you know, the solar panels.
Well, if I may interject, economics I thought was no more a problem because, I mean, already we see that solar and wind, even without indigenization, is the cheapest source.
Yeah, you are right about that.
Really
it's the price, but you know, still what the returns which we are giving, because the import, because of the regulatory structures, you know, it is still the cost of deploying a solar or a wind is not as cheap as in those countries because of the added advantage, because of they have the manufacturing facilities. So what I want to say is that, you know, if a country has already a manufacturing facilities in the country, that is much more easier to deploy the solar or the wind resources.
No, fair point. I think they're cost competitive compared to us. Yet I would argue that you know renewable, either at utility scale, more so at distributed scale, things like rooftop solar is the cheapest source. And I think there's overwhelming evidence from across the globe and even in Pakistan which proves that. I know of this initiative that ADB has kicked off, which is around storage. And we have this very simple belief that when storage and solar become cheaper than coal, then everything will be solar and storage. And I do know that ADB has an active initiative in that area. So you want to talk about how storage could play a part in terms of stabilizing the grid?
Storage, the prices are still much higher, So we approved a pilot project last year for 30 megawatts for NTDC and to couple with the solar of a US funded project. But I would still say that, okay, once the battery prices come down, then that would be really a game changer, in terms of getting rid of many other, inefficiencies in the system. But I think so this is still a long time to go. In fact, yeah, it's in infancy stage. It has at least maybe 10 years or so for Pakistan. That's what I would say.
So we see that there's this something called the Wright's law, which is the costs go down by 18% when the volume doubles, and that's been true for a lot of technologies, not just in energy, but we see that more so for storage and solar. And I think based on that, our prediction says probably next 3-4 years, solar and storage will be at parity with the base load. But of course, we have been wrong on forecast, but in a positive way, that these things have been progressing faster than what we thought.
The prices are coming down faster as we projected as well. So let's see. I think if these things would be game changers,
Absolutely. So I do want to touch upon climate change. I do know that there's a different department that looks after that aspect within Asian Development Bank. I think it's a singular most important topic for the planet and for our species, but more so from a Pakistan perspective, being the 7th most worst affected country on the index, and also from an opportunity perspective that there's this massive opportunity to reindustrialize the whole globe. Do you want to play a meaningful part? So what is that ADB is doing to work climate change, and what aspect of that is evident in Pakistan?
So we, on the energy side, what has been our focus is on the energy. Actually, we have this hydropower we are discussing now, so that will be on the mitigation side. We are going to approve next year Balakot hydropower project, 300 megawatt, and we are discussing with WABDA for another couple of projects, maybe Patan, which is 2450 megawatts, and then Lower Palas is 665. So that could be and this will serve two purposes. First of all, it will use the indigenous resources, bring the cost of generation down, and as well as help in climate change, and get rid of the thermals, especially the old Gencos and whatnot eventually, and the imported, because of the external weak situation. Then on the retrofitting, we are discussing, that if by the old Gencos we could assist them, Jamshoro we are changing the whole. Although it will still be thermal, but with a more benign technology, which can be more carbon neutral, I would say. On the distribution side, I think the transformers, the smart metering, the smart grid, that will have some impact. But that is a way to go. Maybe another 5 years or so, ADB will be coming up with such programs. Smart metering is being rolled out already, but that is only at a pilot basis in some discos. Having said that, our urban sector, which is playing a big role in BRTs, so the Peshawar BRT, then the Karachi BRT, that would again play a role in mitigation. Now ADB, when we do the project, any project which is approved by our ADB board, we have somehow tell that if it's a 100 million project, that how much of that financing would be for adaptation and mitigation. So that comes out to be about $800 million, dollars, $80 billion, sorry, for. But I don't know how the real quantification is because 80 billion is our estimates.
Right.
Then we also, ADB at our headquarter level in Manila, we manage some climate change funds which can provide capacity support, analytical support to the projects being developed. We help to drawing funds from GCF, but that is more at the Manila level. But in Pakistan, it's energy. We are coming up, but slowly but surely.
So energy is a big part. So I think it's 50% of the contribution is from energy to greenhouse emissions. So I think it's a very, very important area. Asad, there's a lot more to talk about. I think just that the time doesn't permit us to go any further. I think we've scratched the surface, but I hope we've been able to touch upon some very important areas from Asian Development Bank and from a local context perspective. There's just a small piece where if we do, we play a game called Long Short with our guests on this forum. Long Short basically, the inspiration has been taken from the equity markets. So for example, if you were optimistic about future prospects of a company, you would go long, you would invest in that company. And if you were pessimistic, you would sell the shares. Shorts, sell them. Our compliance to Paris Agreement on climate change.
I think short.
Short. Okay, that's a very strong statement. Circular debt in Pakistan.
Long in the long term. The government has its will this time, so let's see. But
so you long from a perspective of solving it. It will be solved, right?
Yeah.
It won't be around for...
I think so it will be solved because all the IMF, world, everybody's, we are after the government now.
Right. Renewable generation in Pakistan?
Long.
Right. Distributed generation?
I think short in the short term, and then maybe once the other things are set in place, I think then it will be long. Yeah.
Pakistan's performance against sustainable development goals?
I think it's medium. I would say it's short. I think so.
Right.
Because we have been changing the goal. Well, in fact, UN has been changing the goals, after every few decades. So, but Pakistan's performance on the social indicators is not that great.
Right. The final one would be readiness of industry to address the challenges of climate change going forward from a sustainability perspective. I'll rephrase this. So sustainable development in the commercial sector.
Well, it depends, how tough the regulations are. But I would say long because then it goes to Paris Agreement, as you say. I've said short as well. I would say long in the long term. Currently, I don't think so. The industry is really
so we're well behind.
Yeah,
we're well behind from your perspective. So, Asad, it's been good fun. I think we've learned a bunch of things from you. I think thanks a lot for taking time out. I think ADB is doing some very valuable work, and we can only thank the organization for its contribution to the local economy.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much.